my first virtual session. So I've not done a virtual presentation like this before, full disclosure, but I am super excited that you're all here. The plan, I'll go over the plan next, actually. How about that? So first, a little bit about me. Here are some of my credentials. The first two are standard, like you paid for your credentials. The second two are more professional side, you paid for your credentials. And the last two are more like life skill credentials. And the only reason that I'm including all of these is because I think that you should be credentialed by more than things that you can just financially afford. So I've been enjoying listening to kids since about 2012. Before that time, I didn't really like it, but starting then, I did start to like it. But you can see that I do have some experience in the field. And for this presentation, go over what we'll be talking about today. So first, I'll talk about the action research project that I did for my master's program. It was about memory and experiential education, which is sort of what led to this presentation that I'm giving today. I have 3 breakout sessions that you can see, and each one is sort of like follow-ups to each of the sessions that we're going to go over. So then following that, we'll talk about experiential education, have a breakout, and then we'll talk about memory and sort of what that means and what types there are and stuff like that. And then we'll have a last breakout session, and then at the end, we'll do like a review and a summary and final thoughts. And then I'll show you all my references that you may be interested in, maybe not. So my goals for this session for you all are to improve our formative and our summative feedback assessment by addressing our learners' experience, engaging our learners in learning by facilitating meaningful multisensory experiences, and then hopefully we can also learn to help learners remember program content better by incorporating mnemonics into our programs. So those are my goals for the session, but I would like to, let's see, how do I do this? I would like to have you all in the chat let me know what audiences you work with so that I can see. Here, I can pull up my chat string. This is why I'm trying to find this. So what audiences do you work with so that I can see kind of who you all are and maybe think about how what we're talking about today can address what you work with. Well, there we go. All ages, kindergarten, elementary, preschool to active adults. Elementary to high school, 4th grade. A lot. There's a lot of school-based, it looks like, and then maybe a few that do adult programs as well, and public programs. Great. So my action research project was about, was focused on 3rd graders and 8th graders specifically. So my research really relates to the populations that I had, but I think my plan is to expand on some of that and hopefully help you all as well to relate this to our whole audience today. Awesome. Cool. Thanks everybody who responded. And if you didn't respond, that's totally fine. You don't have to. Sweet. This is so weird to not hear everybody at the same time, but I appreciate that you're participating through the chat. So my action research project was called Experience and Memory, adapting the method of loci to improve recall during environment-led programs. I'll go over what the method of loci is in a minute. It's just one mnemonic device that has been around for a very long time. So my action research project started because there were this quantitative and this qualitative thing that I wanted to improve at our programs. So I just finished up a graduate fellowship at Walking Mountain Science Center in Avon, Colorado. And my action research project was a way to work with the kids while doing research, basically, is what action research is. So I looked at our post-assessment scores for the previous year. For the 2017-2018 school year, our average post-assessment scores overall were 67%, which is like, I think that's a D in most schools. Wait, yeah. So not great, but I mean, it's okay. We do some hard science stuff there. And then the average post-assessment score specifically for 8th graders was 44%, which is not that great in my opinion. So obviously there's room for improvement there. So I was looking at including that population in this study as well, because I actually really like middle schoolers and I like talking to them. So then there's also this qualitative thing that, like, when I'm out in the field, sometimes I'm struggling to maintain our learners' interests throughout their activities. They like get bored. You all know, you're like doing something and then they like, oh, there's a worm. So being able to engage learners throughout the entire activity and do something that engages what their interests are was something that I cared about as well, especially as it related to, in this case, improving our post-assessment scores at Walking Mountains. So I wanted to do something involving memory with this presentation, or with this research, because memory is something that I think a lot about and that I care about. My grandma on my mom's side had dementia and later died from complications of that. And just seeing a family member struggle with memory problems and memory loss is really hard. So my mom's also like starting to show signs of that. And so I wanted to think about memory and maybe how that can relate to students for as simple as like our assessments. So learning with memory involves this idea of richness of encoding. Encoding is when you're getting memory, getting experiences and storing them into your brain, basically. Encoding is like when you're looking around and you're seeing all the things and you're experiencing everything. That's the encoding process. It's your sensory input and being kept into your working memory. And the method of loci is this mnemonic that associates locations along a path with items that you're trying to remember. So for example, a common one is like, if you want to remember a grocery list, then, and you're really familiar with your drive from your home to your work, then you could think about different points along that route and associate apples, for example, with a tree that you drive by that's really cool because apples grow on trees. And so like as you're driving and imagining that drive to your work, you're seeing the tree and you're remembering, oh yeah, I need to get apples for my groceries. That's like a weak example, but that's generally how that works with the method of loci. So the method of loci, there was not a lot of research with kids and outside of classrooms and outside of memorizing lists. So I knew that I had to make some sort of adaptation to this method, but I figured it could work because we usually go along routes when we're teaching in the field that have like specific places along like where we're teaching. So each place we stop, we teach, we go somewhere else, we stop, we teach something. And so I figured it might be something that could be easily adaptable. So I thought maybe it could work, and maybe we could, instead of memorizing a list of specific things, we could remember the concepts that we're trying to address on our post-assessments. So that was, and if you have any questions at any point, write them in the chat box, please. I've got Beth there monitoring the chat for us, so I really appreciate that. And if I'm going too fast or anything, just let me know. So my research question was, will this adaptation of the method of loci help our learners, which in this case were 3rd graders and 8th graders, retain that knowledge that they gained during our outdoor programs? And that would be measured by our post-assessment scores. My plan of action for this research was an adaptation of this MLL, which was to use those multiple sensory observations to associate each distinct location with the distinct educational lessons. Normally, the method of loci is a familiar route that you're already familiar with, so I wanted to engage the senses and engage the experiential aspects of being in our programs. So even if the kids like weren't familiar with our routes yet at Walking Mountains, they usually come every year from like even kindergarten through 8th grade anyways. But for especially the 3rd graders, they might not be familiar with it, so I wanted to be familiar with it as quickly and easily as possible. So at each stop, we did a sort of guided exploration of each spot, and then we did our lesson that we were supposed to do, and then we sort of wrapped it up with like, what did you learn about here, and like what makes this place unique, to try to put the item to be remembered with that specific location. And we'll talk about how that went later. So as you can see here, these are the 5 things that I was really trying to do with my project. You may have to move the little like window of who the speaker is to see all of the things on my slides apparently, but you can do that on your own. So my participants were Eel County School students during the months of January and February this year, right before everything shut down. So I was able to finish my research, thankfully. But I had 20 3rd graders from one school, 29 3rd graders from another school, and 53 from an 8th grade school. So close to even enough. I had these instruments, the pre and post assessments, a field journal page where students were able to write or draw things that they noticed about each spot and what they learned about. Participation analysis was just sort of a check to see who was actually participating, who wasn't, based on our observation. A focus group we did at the end of the day with 1 experimental and 1 control group. And that was just 2 to 4 questions, and we'll go over what those questions were later. And then an instructor reflection, so I was able to also get feedback from each of the instructors asking about how they thought it went and what they thought. So there were 4 days, 3 programs. So the 3rd grade program took place in 1 day. The other 3rd grade program took place in a day, and the 8th graders, because there were so many, we split it up across 2 days. And there were half experimental and control groups both times, and there were 2 focus groups each day, like I said, 1 experimental and 1 control. So my results, I ended up with 102 pre-post assessment pairs. So that was a lot. I learned how to use Excel pretty well, and I learned how to use SPSS really well, which is the data processing. But then I ended up with 7 focus groups, which was several minutes. I didn't actually measure how long all the audio was, but I got some really cool audio, and I'll share some quotes from some of those later. And then instructor reflection forms were just written out from each of the instructors, and I got a lot of feedback on that too. So the reason I'm showing you some of this breakdown is that I wanted to show that just looking at the overall score doesn't, I feel like, give you a fair representation of what students are learning in a program. So if you see that 8th graders overall got 44% on their post-assessment scores for the 2017-2018 school year, that means that each student got somewhere around that, but also that each question ranged pretty differently as well. And you can see here on the left, there was a question about snowflake ingredients. So we taught 3rd graders, what are the ingredients of a snowflake? And the pre-assessment is the lower ones, which, that's pretty normal. And the post-assessments are the higher ones, and the experimental in this case is blue, and the control groups in this case is orange. And you can see that on the left, the snowflake ingredients question had a pretty large rise from pre to post scores. But for the other question that was about water cycle definitions, there was a much lower increase between the pre and the post assessments. So that could mean a lot of things. It could have something to do with the type of question. For example, the snowflake ingredients question was multiple choice, whereas the water cycle definitions was like a word and then a definition, and you had to match them. So it involved a little bit more reading and understanding of the concepts. But also it could really reflect what we did during the day, like how well we actually addressed each of those concepts with the activities that we did. And it could also be a whole bunch of other factors. It could be that they didn't they're third graders and they're not super great at writing and reading yet. So who knows? But that was outside of the scope of this research. But you can see there's a disclaimer at the bottom. There was no significant difference between the experimental group increases and the control group increases for third graders. Moving ahead to eighth grade, this has a lot on it, but on the chart on the right, each section that's green and purple is one of the questions again, and experimental in this case is green, and control in this case is purple. And you can see that for the avalanche ingredients question, the one on the left, there actually was a much higher increase for the avalanche ingredients question for the experimental groups than for the control groups. But part of that is because in the control group in this case, at least for this particular study, the control groups in this group were scoring pretty high already on the control group. So who knows what that's about. And then some other interesting things, you can look at the numbers and see for yourself. In a couple cases, the scores go down, but none of the data was statistically significant. And a lot of that was, or the reason for the lack of statistic significance was I had a really small sample for like doing a statistically significant study. So 59 eighth graders is pretty small for looking at these numbers. And again, each of the question types were different. So avalanche ingredients was multiple choice. Weather versus climate was like you had to write down what each thing was and like what's the difference and similarity, etc. You can read the slides. So I was trying to see a little bit more in depth about these changes, and I know this is all deep research stuff, but you can take what you want from it. The experimental groups were the ones who were actually doing this intervention. They were the ones who were stopping and like paying attention to the surroundings and making notes about what made each spot unique. And the control groups were just doing a standard program that doesn't necessarily do that. It was not as intentional. Instructors might have done that on their own anyways, just if that's something that they do as a teacher, but that was not part of the control groups overall. What the experimental groups were doing was that intentional method of loci, like associating each spot with each lesson, and the control groups were not. So you can see there was a pretty big change in percent on the top right, the third graders in the control group from AES. That was only 6 students though, and there was one instructor for those kids, and she's actually watching this right now. Good for you, you taught those kids really well that day. But the 8th graders had a little bit higher number of students overall, and you can see that for the other schools, there's a little bit higher of a change in percent between the experimental and control groups, especially for the 8th graders. But if we look at just the post scores, like again, overall, those are not passing grades. The third graders from ECCA, those are passing grades, but also they didn't have too far to increase. I mean, in one case they didn't. But when the 8th graders in the control group have a 49% up from 45%, and the 8th graders in the experimental group have a 58% up from 48%, that's something, but that's still like pretty low, and I think that says something about the assessment itself, as well as our programs, as well as like our teaching and the students that are coming, and how well the schools are preparing them. So many things, you all know. So moving on into, sorry, so those were the more like quantitative data that I gathered, the actual assessment scores. And then I want to skip into some of the qualitative, into the instructors, what they thought about it. So I asked them what they thought helped the students engage with our intervention. The intervention was, again, the method of loci, the intentional stops and explorations at each stop. And the number one thing that instructors wrote were words that related to exploration. Each of these words, by the way, in the word clouds you're going to see are like categories that I created based on what the responses were. So there's a bunch of phrases on here: purpose, group culture, personal interest, peer pressure. Instructors didn't necessarily write those specific words, but like for peer pressure, they may have written something like the kids were trying to impress, blah, 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 blah. So overall, though, they thought the aspect of exploration was helpful for these kids. Another question was what was challenging for the students to engage with this intervention. For third graders, the number one thing that the instructors thought was journaling. With third graders, you know, you have a little journal, you have a pencil in it, you pull it out each time we're trying to make notes about our surroundings and what we learned. And third graders are, you know, still learning to read and write, so that makes sense. For eighth grade, the main things were the weather and their own personal comfort. It was very snowy on the days that we did these programs, so the eighth graders were, overall for them, it was that they were cold, which is fair. And then again, for the instructor perspectives, what did you think about leading the intervention? Was it awkward or easy, etc.? And overall, instructors thought they liked it. They liked being able to get feedback. They liked that students were able to explore more. And they think it was important that kids were able to have fun. So from the instructor perspective, I thought that instructors, based on the feedback, liked it, which is nice, but ultimately I wanted it to be easier for ourselves and the kids. So I'll get into what the student responses were later when we discuss experiential education and memory, but for now I'll skip into the discussion aspect of my research. The improvement was more apparent from the eighth graders in this case. If we went back and looked at the quantitative results, and then when we look at the adult soon, it'll be more apparent from that as well. But in my personal practice, I really came to realize that I want to ask for more learner feedback throughout, like more formative assessment. I want to know how things are going, how you're feeling, so that I can make adjustments along the way. I want to have journals that are effective and enjoyable for students, and I want there to be support during assessment. And we'll talk more about that in a minute as well. And then I also looked at the implications of my research involving flexibility for instructor styles, having consistent assessments, and considering the differences between the schools. One of the schools was a dual language school, which is really awesome. Another school was a charter school, and then the eighth grade school was an expeditionary learning school. So each of these individual schools also were like already had different teaching philosophies, kind of. And then I also learned that I need to ask for things in more explicit and intentional ways, because some of the response students didn't make any sense to me, but it must have made sense to them. And you've probably experienced that as well. So as I am finishing up my research section, I wanted to provide some time, just like a minute or so. It's already 11:20 or 11:15ish almost. So if you have any questions right now based on my research, go ahead and type those into the chat box, and then we'll move into a breakout room. And if you don't have any questions, we can move into the breakout rooms first. So the first breakout session that I have planned, I'd like for us to break out into smaller groups and address these two questions. Talk about these two. How could program assessments reflect the learning better? And does your program assessment affect the experience, or does it reflect just the facts that you hope they're going to remember? So think about the students' side of things and what they're experiencing, and think about when you're assessing them, are you doing that? So Destin, I think that's on you to set up the breakout sessions.
You should have all received a message to join.
Okay, sorry for the wait. Thanks. It was great to like actually see someone and hear someone else talk for a second. So I hope you all appreciated that as well. And I also hope that maybe you got some ideas from that too. So write down anything now before you forget. One of the things about memory is that if you don't space it out in the right way, it is easily lost. So if there was something from that breakout room that you thought was really cool, make sure you write it down now before you forget it later, so that you can actually come back to it and maybe ask the people again later what they meant based on your note, because sometimes we write notes that we don't understand. So anyways, that's going to summarize my research. That's going to finish up most of my research for now. We're going to move into well, my computer will catch up. There we go. We're going to move into the experiential education part of all this. So I found this was in one of the research papers that I read when I was doing research for my project. I thought it was pretty interesting, and it really like resonated with me. Sometimes we pat ourselves on the back just for getting kids into natural areas, but just getting them there and using nature as a backdrop is not enough. I think that is a pretty, I don't know, important idea and things to remember as well. Like, just because you're doing something in a natural setting doesn't mean you're actually using the natural setting. And as environmental educators, I think that is kind of a waste for us as well. So if we're going to be out in nature, let's use it. Right now, this is kind of a weird time to think about that. If we're going to be on our computers, how are we going to get the experience of nature and of the outdoors through that? So experiential education, the definition provided by the Association for Experiential Education is a little bit longer than this quote, but basically it's that educators purposefully engage with learners in direct experience and focused reflection. And those are two things that are really important to what the idea of experiential education is, which I know is different than environmental education, but I personally care about experiential education, and I want there to be a full experience involved. So that's why I was sort of going this direction. And the experience is something that you're actually you're doing. You're not just watching, and you're not like passively participating. You're actively participating in what's happening. And then usually it involves some type of reflection on how it went as well. So that's the experiential part of it. Part of that is also using all of our senses. And I think sometimes we just use a lot of audio and visual a lot of the time. And that's great. A lot of people do learn those ways. We all learn those ways a little bit, but being able to ask questions that get people thinking about the senses that they're using and doing it in really purposeful ways can be really helpful for memory, actually. So if we are doing a program, even virtually, we can actually facilitate the experience by asking them the questions like, what do you smell right now? What do you feel right now? What does your lunch taste like, or whatever? And just like, it's basically like mindfulness, which is something that I sort of tried to cultivate in this research as well, or in my intervention. Basically, like being really mindful about what we're doing and like how we feel in the moment. So when I think about memories that I've had, it's because, or I remember those things because I'm reflecting on like the sensations that I felt. Like when I imagine some of the hikes that I've been on, I remember the cool breeze, and I remember the cold water and stuff like that. So it's not just the things that I saw, the things that I heard, but everything involved with that. And so having a meaningful multisensory experience can really like help get all of those different neurons working in the brain together and like forming an entire package of memory. And doing that with the content that we're teaching can be really impactful and helpful for being able to remember it. And then, as I mentioned previously, the experience should align with our skills with third graders. And like what I was talking about in my breakout room, younger kids, the person I was talking to said that they do more pictures with their younger assessments and younger student assessments, and then fewer pictures, more words for the older kids, because the younger kids are still like getting used to the idea of reading and writing and stuff like that. So that's just one example, but also just like the skills that they're doing should not ask too much of the kids, but also just put them right outside their comfort zone just a little bit. But we should make a safe space for them. Anyways, we're going into our focus group questions for this part because I asked some questions that were about the experience. And so the focus groups, again, for my research, were at the end of the day, and the experimental focus groups in this case were facilitated by different instructors. But this first question was, what did you like about exploring each location? And the kids said things like, now this is distracting me. Kids said things that involved playing and having fun and being outdoors. And obviously the kids, I don't think any kid actually ever said experiential learning, but they said things like getting to do the research ourselves, or like being able to see it for ourselves, or being able to work with my friends to complete the task that was at hand. Like those are experiential things that obviously the kids liked, because that was the question, what did you like about it? So the kids were having fun and they were doing things in the outdoors. And there's a tiny one there that says using tools. Some of the kids mentioned that as well. The second question was, what did they dislike about it? And overall, they didn't like the coldness of it. These were winter programs, and we were snowshoeing and digging snow pits, and in some cases, and digging, or maybe making snow people. I don't know. It was a while ago. But the cold was really the only thing that they mostly disliked about it. So I just like having these questions about the experience so that I could get a sense of what the kids really thought about it. The next question was asked to both the experimental and control groups, because this one applied to both sections. What did you think about learning this topic in the outdoors? For 8th graders, it was snow science, and for 3rd graders, it was changing states of matter. And kids would say things like it was fun. They would say things like, I liked being able to do it myself instead of like looking at pictures. I liked being outdoors. It's better than being inside. And then content-based activity, that would just be like if they just like named one of the activities that we did that was for our learning content, then that was something that they liked. I included these quotes. I'm realizing that I'm running out of time faster than I thought, as we always are. What do you think helps you remember what we learned? And for the 8th graders, I'll let you read this, but I thought it was actually kind of poignant. So these are different students in my 8th grade experimental focus groups who obviously liked doing it themselves and like being out in the outdoors doing the learning themselves. So we're gonna have another 5-minute breakout session, and I would like for you to discuss with a few people how you might engage senses in more meaningful ways. If you're still doing physical programs, you can talk about that. But if you're moving into virtual learning, how can you ask the questions that might get to engage the senses more? And also, you can address either of these questions. Could there be a space for your program participants to provide you feedback about their learning? Justin, I'll let you split us up into those.
Awesome. I'll be sending you guys back to the same rooms. And how long do we have, Nicholas?
Let's do 3 minutes, actually.
All right, 3 minutes. Here you guys go.
Thanks.
They should start be coming back, Nicholas. We have 40 seconds.
Okay. Is it going okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Just let me know when I should start again.
Will do. All right, all of the breakout rooms should be back or coming back shortly.
Okay. That's what I look like.
And we're good.
Oh, what's my chat box? Awesome. So thank you all for participating. I hope you got something from that as well. Things to consider if you still want to discuss that more later, write it down, talk about it with more people. We have just over 10 minutes left, so we're gonna talk about memory real fast. For my research, I focused on the cognitive information processing theory. There's lots of theories about how memory works. This is one of them. There's a lot of them, and they all kind of work, in my opinion. But this one is just kind of straightforward. It's the idea of processing like a computer. There's sensory input, so just long enough to feel a sensation, like touching your fingers together. There's some sensory memory there, and you can remember what that is briefly. That can be transferred into our working memory or our short-term memory, which may or may not be processed into long-term memory. So each of those arrows are there, but they're not really set in stone. Things don't necessarily go into the next step. There's a lot involved, obviously. So my question for the students was, what do you think helped you remember what we learned? The experimental groups overall said that student-led actions and facilitating by the instructors and being able to perform things and use tools and use their journals, like pretty experiential things, were what students said helped them remember what they learned. In the control group, when we still did the same like lessons, but we didn't do the guided explorations. Students said more things that related to the content-based activities, which, as I mentioned before, they were basically just naming the activity that we did. So there were fewer details in the control groups about what they thought helped them remember what they learned, which I thought was pretty interesting. So things that affect our memory, our recollection, being able, like remembering things and recalling it over and over again, obviously is pretty helpful. How familiar you are with a concept and the encoding process itself have varying degrees of effects on our memory. So if your kids like that are learning something brand new for the first time with you, they're not very familiar with it, they might need a lot of extra support being able to remember that concept. Whereas like if the teachers from the school are already like they've already done the lesson and then they come to your program and the kids like know all the answers already, that's great. And they're familiar with it, so you can build on that and it'll really help keep it in their memory as well. And being able to recall things that they learned from the classroom will help keep it all in there as well. And then of course that encoding process, which is what I was trying to use multisensory experiential learning for that aspect. And then in other research, you can see that when we could list higher numbers of features for items, we could
Nicholas, not sure if you're there, but I'm going to start sending them back. So I'm going to press the button and they'll be back in a minute. All right, we should be back.
Sorry it's so short. Thank you all for doing that with me. Yeah, I appreciate that. I hope y'all appreciate that. And again, write things down now before you forget. But pretty cool. I'm glad y'all are all here. So in summary, I like to use this quote. I use this quote for my research. I hear, I forget, I see, I remember, I do, I understand. This is a first English translation of a quote that nowadays is sometimes kind of accredited to Confucius or Ben Franklin, I've seen, where they say, tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn. And neither of those, Confucius nor Benjamin Franklin, ever said that, but this is an ancient Chinese text that had this specific quote in it. And I just wanted to review what we did today. So I talked too long about my action research project, obviously, but hopefully you can see how action research can formalize our improvements in education. It just sort of helps us set like specific goals and maybe like specifically